Amsterdam's glittering facade, and the forgotten victims. The 17th century marked the height of the Dutch Golden Age, a period of immense prosperity, artistic triumph, and global expansion. Amsterdam, the jewel of the Dutch Republic, stood as a beacon of trade, innovation, and culture. Merchants amassed enormous fortunes, fueling a thriving economy that supported some of history's greatest painters, including Rembrandt and Vermeer. The city became a global hub for finance, home to the world's first stock exchange and multinational corporations. To the world, Amsterdam seemed like the pinnacle of progress, tolerance, and enterprise. Yet beneath the grandeur of its canals, behind the doors of its imposing merchant houses, and within the pages of ledgers filled with transactions of spices, silver, and textiles, lay a dark and often unspoken truth. Amsterdam's wealth was inextricably tied to the forced labor of hundreds of thousands of enslaved people across Africa, the Americas, and Asia. The Dutch Republic, despite its reputation for liberalism and human rights, played a crucial yet concealed role in the global slave trade. Unlike the Spanish or Portuguese, who openly traded slaves in their home countries, the Dutch kept their involvement at a distance, outsourcing the brutality to their colonial possessions and corporate networks. This allowed the illusion of a free society in the Netherlands, while ensuring that slavery remained at the heart of Amsterdam's economy. For centuries, this history remained obscured, ignored, or deliberately erased. However, the legacy of Amsterdam's hidden slave trade is still woven into the fabric of the city's wealth, its institutions, and its very identity. The rise of Amsterdam as a global slave trading hub. By the early 1600s, Amsterdam had transformed into Europe's dominant trading center. The city's rise was fueled by its powerful merchant companies, particularly the Dutch East India Company, VOC, and the Dutch West India Company, WC. These corporations, backed by investors in Amsterdam, rapidly expanded Dutch control over Africa, the Americas, and Asia, bringing vast wealth to the city. Although the Dutch initially focused on commodities such as spices, gold, and textiles, they soon recognized that the most profitable trade of all was human lives. The demand for forced labor in the colonies, particularly on sugar and tobacco plantations, skyrocketed in the early 17th century. The Dutch Republic quickly became one of the most dominant forces in the transatlantic and Indian Ocean slave trades, with Amsterdam serving as the nerve center of this exploitation. Founded in 1621, the Dutch West India Company, WIC, played a central role in the transatlantic slave trade, focusing its operations on the shipment of enslaved Africans to Suriname, the Caribbean, Brazil, and North America. The WIC aggressively sought control over major slave trading ports in Africa, launching military campaigns against the Portuguese and Spanish to seize their lucrative markets. The company's most significant victory came in 1637, when Dutch forces captured Elmina Castle in Ghana, one of the largest slave trading centers on the West African coast. This fortress became a crucial point of departure for tens of thousands of enslaved Africans who were forcibly shipped across the Atlantic under brutal conditions. The WIC also took control of Luanda in Angola, another major slave trading hub, further cementing the Netherlands' dominance over the trade. During the Middle Passage, enslaved Africans were subjected to horrific conditions aboard Dutch ships. Crammed into the lower decks with barely any space to move, they endured disease, malnutrition, and extreme physical abuse. Many did not survive the voyage, and their bodies were thrown overboard into the Atlantic. Despite the staggering mortality rates, the WIC continued its operations, knowing that the economic benefits far outweighed the human cost. Once they arrived in the Americas, enslaved people were auctioned off like commodities in Dutch-controlled markets. Many were sent to Dutch Brazil, where they worked on massive sugar plantations, enriching Amsterdam's merchants and fueling the city's booming sugar refineries. Others were transported to Suriname, which became one of the most brutal slave economies in the world, notorious for its inhumane conditions and extreme punishments inflicted upon enslaved workers. The Dutch also introduced slavery to New Amsterdam, modern-day New York. Under Dutch rule, enslaved Africans were forced to build key infrastructure, including the very walls that later gave Wall Street its name. Though the Dutch were eventually expelled from the colony by the British in 1664, their legacy in shaping New York's early economy through slavery remains undeniable. The Dutch East India Company and the Indian Ocean slave trade. While the WIC controlled the Atlantic slave trade, the Dutch East India Company, VO, founded in 1602, operated an equally large slave trading network across Asia and the Indian Ocean. Unlike in the Americas, where plantations were the primary driver of slavery, the VOC relied on urban and domestic forced labor to sustain its vast colonial empire. The VOC's headquarters in Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, Indonesia, was built almost entirely by enslaved people from Indonesia, India, Sri Lanka, and Madagascar. These workers were forced to construct fortresses, ships, and canals, providing the infrastructure that allowed the VOC to dominate Asian trade. In Ceylon, Sri Lanka, enslaved people toiled on cinnamon plantations, while in South Africa, the Dutch imported enslaved workers to develop Cape Town as a strategic trading post. Unlike the transatlantic trade, the VOC often disguised slavery under different terms. Enslaved workers were labeled servants or company slaves, creating a legal loophole that allowed the Dutch to maintain the illusion of a free society while still exploiting forced labor. However, the reality was no less brutal. Many enslaved people faced lifelong bondage, physical abuse, and cultural erasure, with their descendants remaining trapped in systems of oppression long after their initial enslavement. Although the Dutch Republic did not openly conduct slave markets within its borders, Amsterdam was the financial nerve center of the global slave trade. Investors in the city funded countless voyages that transported enslaved people across the world. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, established in 1602, played a crucial role, as both the VOC and WIC were publicly traded companies. Many of the city's most powerful bankers, merchants, and officials held shares in these corporations, meaning that thousands of ordinary Dutch citizens indirectly profited from slavery. Amsterdam's famous sugar refineries also depended entirely on enslaved labor in the Caribbean and South America. Sugar, known as white gold, was one of the most valuable commodities in the world, and the Dutch Republic was one of its largest exporters. The industry was so profitable that it helped finance the construction of Amsterdam's iconic canal houses, many of which belonged to wealthy merchants who had built their fortunes on the suffering of enslaved people. Even Amsterdam's insurance companies were deeply involved in slavery, insuring slave ships and plantations against losses. This financial system ensured that the slave economy remained deeply entrenched in the city's economy, even as slavery itself remained legally absent from Dutch soil. Reckoning with Amsterdam's slave trade legacy. For centuries, Amsterdam's role in slavery was whitewashed, ignored, or downplayed. Dutch historians and government officials often framed the Golden Age as an era of innovation and progress, conveniently omitting the millions of lives destroyed in the process. However, in recent years, this narrative has begun to change. In 2023, the Dutch government formally apologized for its role in slavery, acknowledging that its wealth was built, in part, on human suffering. Museums, universities, and activists are now working to uncover the full extent of Amsterdam's involvement in slavery, pushing for a deeper reckoning with the past. Though the city remains a global symbol of prosperity, it is now forced to confront a long-buried truth, that its riches came at a horrific cost. Perhaps, only by acknowledging this past can Amsterdam truly move toward justice and reconciliation.